So let's take a look at how this works on the node side when we're dealing with factories and repositories. All right, so what we've got here is an application that's going to pull in three different repositories. We've got a task repository, we've got a user repository, we've got a project repository. And what this application is doing is then using those three repositories to new up a new task and add a user to the task and add a project to the task. And then we're going to save that out to the database. So what this ends up looking like is kind of junky, because up here at the top, you've got three different repositories that you're pulling in, and it can kind of add a lot of stuff to this main.js. And that's not what we want to have happen. But what I'll show you real quick is what this looks like when we run it, just so you can see. Notice we're newing up a task repository, getting task one, user one, project one. Then there's our console.log task. There's our task, and then we're saving it to the database. Okay, what we're going to do is we're going to add a factory, and that factory is going to replace lines 2 through 4 and get rid of those so that we're not having to change main.js or add repositories in here every time we want to pull from a different data source or something like that. We want something else to deal with those things for us. And so we're going to use the factory pattern to create these repositories for us as necessary. So let's look at a repo factory. Now, this is just a simple factory with a function called getRepo. And that function takes a string that's just the repository type and then checks what type of repository I'm looking for, task, user, project, and will then return a require to that task repository or user repository or project repository. So the very simplistic thing that this looks like is, hey, give me a repository and I'm going to give you the type. So in main2.js, we've converted this, and now I can call repofactory.getRepo and the task, and that's going to return back a instance of task repository. And then it will give me a user or a project based upon what I'm sending back. Notice up on line 2, I only have my repo factory. Over in main.js, the way we were doing this before, I had 3 repos up here. Now I just have the factory. Now this isn't quite super awesome because I've added something to my task repository that down here on line 16, console.log, newing up a task repo. And when I run main2.js, I'm newing up task repos all over the place. So this isn't the end product. This is just where we're starting. So what we're going to do instead is we're going to cache our repository. So I've created a new one, repo factory with cache. And now if you look, repo equals task. Then if I check to see if this.task repo exists already. And if it does, I just hand it back. Otherwise, I new up a new task repository and return that. What that does for us is instead of creating a new task repository every time, I can just go and cache that in my factory. One thing to keep in mind is I might have config code right here. That's part of the benefit of the factory pattern is I can drop all my config code in the factory before I return it, and then I don't have to deal with that over on my main.js code. All right, so let's look at our main2.js where we're using the repo factory, and now let's switch it over to use the one with cache. Now what you'll see when we run this, if you look here, we've got 3 newing up task repos. This first one and the third one are from creating these 2 new tasks. The second one actually comes from our task, where it news up its own task repository. And I'm going to leave that there for right now. So what you're actually going to see is we'll just drop one of these. We'll drop the second one, and this will be coming out of the cache. And we can actually say, come right down here and put a console.log in, retrieving from cache. Let's run that. All right, see now that newing up task repo here became retrieving from cache. So now we're caching our repositories kind of just as they're needed. We're not loading them all up right away. We're just caching them as they're needed and then running them that way. All right, so that's a simple factory. Just, hey, I'm going to go and get something and pull it back. If you look at our code, though, this repo factory.getRepo task.get, that's kind of kludgy and it feels kind of icky. So there's one other way we're going to look at to use our factory to clean this look up a little bit. So the way we're about to implement the factory pattern actually is used in gulp load plugins. So if you use Gulp at all, Gulp Load Plugins is a fantastic tool that basically runs this factory pattern over all of the Gulp plugins that you might use for your code. And let's take a quick look at what this looks like. So basically you do var gulp equals require gulp, and then gulp load plugins equals gulp load plugins. And what gulp load plugins is going to do is it does all the requires for every gulp dash thing. It looks in your package.json file and all the gulp dash stuff, it just loads that on its own. So now I have plugins.jshint or plugins.concat. And that just simplifies everything up in the top area of your gulp file. We're going to take this same basic idea and do it for our repositories. So what I want to do, if you look at main3.js now, I want to do repofactory.task or repofactory.user or repofactory.project. Main 2, we had to do repofactory.getRepo task and .get, and I don't, like I said before, that looks kind of kludgy. So what we're going to do now is we're going to implement a factory that lets me do this, repofactory.task. And you can actually change repofactory to just repos and have it look nice and clean. So let's look at how we implement that. So the way we start here is I'm going to create a copy of this called repos. So repos just refers back to the object scope for repo factory, because down at the bottom when we do on module.exports, I'm newing up that repo factory. So this refers to, or repos refers to the object scope for my repo factory. And I'm going to use that here in my for each callback. Now, I have a list of repositories, and this list could come from anywhere. I could look at a specific directory. I could just go out, hey, let's go out to my /repo directory and load all of the files that are in that repository directory and drop everything before repository. So now I've got task repository, the name is task, the source is /task repository. Then I just do a simple repo list.forEach and repos .name. Remember when we were talking about objects, I'm using bracket notation now because I'm using a variable to add. So repos bracket notation repo.name. So .task, .user, .project equals require, and I just require my source. So repos bracket task equals require /task repository. Repos user equals require, and I just run all those requires right there. What that does for me is now look at back at main3.js, I have this very simple, clean repofactory.task, repofactory.user. And the factory is taking care of creating all my repositories for me. I don't have to worry about any of that stuff. And pulling all that back, and now in my main, it's just this simple little, hey, I've got a repo factory, and here I'm pulling tasks, I'm pulling users, I'm pulling projects, and everything just works. And if we run main3.js, there we go. Everything just works. Now, notice we're not pulling anything from cache, and that is because everything was cached inside my repo factory. So when I created a new repo factory, it just cached it in my repo factory automatically, and then it dealt with all of that caching for me.